Hey there! Ready for another deep dive? This time, we're tackling Azure Cloud. Got a whole bunch of videos here, all about the basics.
Yeah, it's like we're building a house, but like in the cloud, you know?
Okay, I like that
So,
analogy. So let's say you're a startup and you're about to launch this awesome new app. What are the first things you need to think about on Azure?
but just like a real building, you got to start with a solid foundation. That's where Azure accounts come in. It's like the legal and financial groundwork for your whole cloud project.
So it's not just as easy as like signing up with a credit card and boom, you're in the cloud. What makes Azure accounts different? I always hear all this confusing stuff about tenants and subscriptions.
Yeah, it's definitely a little more to it than that. Okay, so think about it this way. You have your overall Microsoft account, right?
Right.
That's linked to something called a tenant.
Hmm.
It's basically the umbrella for your users and permissions across all Microsoft stuff,
Mm-hmm.
not just Azure.
Okay.
It used to be called an Azure AD tenant, but now it's Microsoft Entra ID tenant because it's got a wider reach.
So the tenant is like the blueprint for who has access to what across like the whole Microsoft universe.
Exactly. And then under that tenant, you have subscriptions. These are the things linked to your credit card and specific Azure resources. So you could have one for development, another for testing, and then a separate one for the live app, once it's launched.
Ah, that makes more sense. So it's like different departments within your startup, each with its budget and resources. It's not like some other platforms where the tenant itself handles billing.
You got it. And there are also different types of subscriptions. There are free ones for learning, student discounts, pay as you go, even ones where you don't pay for certain software licenses if you're just in like a dev test phase.
Oh, that's clever.
That's
Okay, so
rough.
the tenant is for identity, the subscription is for billing and specific resources. But where does the app actually run? That's where the whole physical architecture of Azure comes in, right? All that stuff about geographies and regions. It always sounds a bit overwhelming to me.
No, it's actually pretty logical. Like, imagine those nested Russian dolls.
Mhm.
So, like, the whole world is the biggest doll. That's your global market. Inside that, you got smaller dolls representing geographies. So, like North America, Europe, Asia, you know. And then each geography contains regions East US, West US, North Europe, and so on.
Okay, so I'm seeing the nesting pattern here, but why does this all matter for our startup? I mean, why not just pick any random spot on the Azure map to launch this app?
Yeah, that's a great question because choosing the right region is actually super important for a few reasons. Let's say your startup is based in India, right?
Mm.
And your app needs to store all this user data, but it needs to stay within India for legal reasons.
Right.
You need to select a region that's within the India geography to make sure you're complying with those data residency rules.
Ah, so it's not just technical, it's also legal and all those regulatory requirements.
Exactly. And then there's also latency to think about or how quickly your app responds.
Yeah.
If most of your users are in Europe, choosing a region in Europe will make the app feel much snappier for them.
So closer is better, generally, for the user experience.
Yeah, for the most part.
Okay. But what if like a whole region goes down? Like there's some kind of major disaster. How does Azure handle that?
Well, that's where availability zones come in. Think of them as like backup data centers, but within a region.
Okay.
So if one goes down, your app can automatically switch over to another one. It minimizes the downtime. And Azure also has these things called region pairs for even more resilience. It's like two regions that back each other up, and they get updated sequentially so that they're never both down at the same time.
Ah, that's clever. So like even if there's a huge earthquake or a power outage, my app still has a good chance of staying online.
Exactly. It's all about minimizing risk.
That makes a lot of sense, especially for a new company that's just starting out. Now, I've always been a little confused by those recommended and other regions that Azure mentions. What's the difference?
Yeah, so the recommended ones, they usually have the most services and features, while the other regions might be newer, or maybe they have some special compliance features.
So like if our startup needed super strict data protection, like for healthcare or something, we might have to go with an other region, even if it has fewer bells and whistles.
Exactly. And then there are sovereign regions.
Sovereign regions.
Yeah, for governments or industries with like really, really specific security needs.
Okay, so we've talked about where the app's data lives, how Azure keeps it safe, but what about the actual servers that run the app? The videos kept mentioning these things called virtual machines.
Right. So think of virtual machines like powerful computers in the cloud. So instead of buying and managing all those physical servers yourself, you just rent these virtual ones from Azure.
So it's like having all the power of like a high-end computer, but without the hassle of setting it up and maintaining it.
Exactly. And you have a lot of choices when you're setting up a virtual machine. You choose the operating system, how much storage you need, even the level of redundancy for your data. Like, do you want it backed up just within one data center or across multiple regions for extra safety?
So it's like deciding how much insurance to buy for your servers, but it's all happening in the cloud.
That's a great way to put it. You're basically customizing the level of risk you're willing to take.
This is making a lot more sense now. But all this talk about virtual machines makes me wonder, where does all the data actually live? Like the code for the app, the images that users upload, all that stuff. Is it all crammed onto those virtual machines?
Well, that's where Azure storage accounts come in. They're like specialized warehouses for different types of data.
Yeah, the videos mention like a bunch of different options, blobs, files, queues, tables. It seemed like a lot.
They can be, but each type has a specific purpose. So for our startup app, we might use blob storage to hold images and videos that users upload, and then like file storage for documents that they might collaborate on.
Blobs, is that like an Azure term or are we talking about something slimy?
Haha. No, it stands for binary large object. Basically, they're massive containers that hold any type of data you can imagine.
Okay, so blobs are for the big stuff. Files are for, well, files. What about queues and tables?
So queues are like a holding area for messages between different parts of your app.
Okay,
Like imagine a digital post office.
gotcha.
And then tables are for storing structured data, kind of like a lightweight database.
Okay, so Azure gives you a whole toolbox of storage options depending on what your app needs to do and how you want to organize everything.
Exactly. And just like with the virtual machines, you get to choose redundancy options for your storage too. So do you want your data backed up just locally, or do you want copies in other regions for that extra peace of mind?
Wow, redundancy seems like a recurring theme in Azure. It makes sense, especially for a startup that can't afford any downtime. It feels like they're really focused on keeping your app running no matter what happens.
Yeah, and speaking of keeping things running smoothly, that brings us to some key concepts in cloud computing that are really essential to understanding what Azure can do. Let's start with scalability and elasticity, those two terms that people often use interchangeably, but they actually have different meanings.
Yeah, I think the videos mentioned like a grocery store analogy to explain this.
Right, so imagine a busy grocery store, checkout lines are getting long, horizontal scaling is like opening more checkout lanes when the store gets busy, so you're essentially adding more servers to handle that increased traffic.
And vertical scaling is like giving each cashier a faster scanner and more bagging space. So you're beefing up the existing servers rather than adding new ones.
Perfect. Now, elasticity. That refers to the cloud's ability to scale up or down automatically based on demand. It's like a magical grocery store that can instantly open and close lanes as needed.
So elasticity is about responding to changes, and scalability is about the overall capacity.
You got it. And Azure has this thing called auto-scaling, which can automatically adjust your resources based on things like CPU usage or network traffic.
Okay, so that sounds incredibly helpful, especially for a new company that's launching an app. You can't predict how much traffic you're going to get, so having Azure just like scale things up or down automatically could be a lifesaver.
It really can be. It helps ensure optimal performance and keeps costs down because you're only paying for what you're actually using. But yeah, there's a catch. Auto-scaling is a magic bullet. You have to be aware of its limitations.
Okay, so it's not just set it and forget it. What kind of things do we need to consider?
Well, for one, you need to carefully define the metrics that are going to trigger those scaling actions. Otherwise, you could end up over-provisioning your resources, and you'll end up spending way more than you need to.
Right, so you got to find that sweet spot between having enough resources to handle the traffic, but also not wasting money on servers that are just sitting there idle.
Exactly. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that auto-scaling has a certain lag time. It takes a few minutes for those new servers to spin up or shut down. So it's not an instant solution for like those sudden traffic spikes.
Okay, so be mindful of those limitations, have some backup plans in place. But overall, auto-scaling seems like an incredibly powerful tool for managing your app's resources as it grows.
It really is.
Now, the videos also talked about fault tolerance and disaster recovery. Can you explain the difference between those two?
Sure. So think of fault tolerance like having backup generators in your office. If the power goes out, the generators kick in and you can keep working. It's about minimizing disruption from those smaller failures. Disaster recovery, on the other hand, is more like having an evacuation plan in place, in case of a major earthquake or something. It's about recovering from those catastrophic events that take out a whole data center or even an entire region.
So fault tolerance is like keeping the lights on during those minor hiccups, and disaster recovery is bouncing back from something truly devastating.
Exactly. And just like with real-world disasters, having a solid plan in place can make all the difference.
This has been incredibly helpful. We've covered so much, from the basics of accounts and architecture to these concepts of scalability, elasticity, fault tolerance, and disaster recovery. It's clear that Azure is built with resilience in mind,
Absolutely, it is.
which is so important, especially for startups.
Absolutely. And, next time we'll dive into the business implications of all this.
Mm.
We'll explore how these features actually translate into real-world benefits for businesses like yours. We'll also tackle some of the common misconceptions that people have about cloud computing.
Sounds like we've got a lot more to uncover. Until then, we've given you, our listener, plenty to think about. Think about how these concepts might apply to your own work, or maybe to your projects, and get ready to dive even deeper into the world of Azure next time. Welcome back. Last time we were talking about building that digital foundation for our startup's app. Now I'm curious, what are the actual, tangible benefits of going all in on the cloud? Is it just hype? Or is this stuff really transformative for businesses?
It's definitely more than just hype. The cloud has it's revolutionized how businesses operate. And we see these advantages play out in real-world scenarios, like every day. Remember all those benefits we were talking about last time? High availability, scalability,
Yeah.
elasticity. Yeah. Those are game changers.
Okay, so let's break it down. We touched on high availability before, but how does that actually translate into real business value?
Well, think about it this way. Your app, that's your storefront, your 24/7 salesperson,
Right.
right? Downtime, that's like closing your shop doors, turning customers away. But with Azure's built-in redundancy, like those availability zones and region pairs we were talking about, your app is much more likely to stay online, even if something unexpected happens.
So it's not just about preventing crashes, it's about protecting your revenue and your reputation.
Yeah.
Because if your app's constantly going down, users are going to get frustrated and go somewhere else.
Exactly. And consider the cost of downtime. For some businesses, even a few minutes offline can mean thousands of dollars lost.
Right, especially for e-commerce sites or businesses that rely on those real-time transactions.
Exactly.
The cloud's reliability becomes a huge competitive advantage.
Absolutely.
What about scalability and elasticity? How do those impact the bottom line?
Okay, so imagine our startup. They launch this amazing marketing campaign and suddenly, boom, the app traffic just explodes.
Okay.
Now, with traditional infrastructure, you'd have to predict that surge in advance. You would have bought all these servers to handle it, which would probably sit idle most of the time, costing you money.
Right.
But with the cloud, you can scale up on demand, and you only pay for what you use.
So it's like having a flexible workforce that can grow or shrink as needed.
Exactly.
No more overspending on IT infrastructure that you're only using occasionally.
You got it. And then elasticity takes it even further by automating that scaling process.
Okay.
Azure can actually monitor your app, and it'll automatically add or remove resources based on predefined rules that you set.
So it's like having a self-driving car, but for your IT infrastructure, it just adjusts to the road conditions automatically.
Exactly. It just handles it all for you, so you don't have to worry about it.
I like that. What about global reach? How does the cloud help businesses expand beyond their borders?
Well, remember our startup launching in India? What if they want to take over the world?
World domination.
Expand to Europe,
Oh.
North America. With the cloud, they can easily deploy their app in those regions, ensuring low latency for users in all those different markets.
So instead of setting up physical data centers in each country, they can leverage Azure's global infrastructure, which saves them a ton of time and money.
Exactly. And Azure provides a unified platform for managing all those resources, no matter where they're physically located.
That's amazing. It really lowers the barrier to entry for those businesses that want to expand internationally.
Absolutely.
Now, security is a big concern for a lot of companies when they're thinking about the cloud. How does Azure address that?
Well, security is honestly a top priority for Microsoft. They invest heavily in physical security for their data centers, network security to protect against cyber threats, and data encryption to keep your information confidential.
Okay.
They also offer those sovereign regions that we were talking about before,
Right.
which are physically isolated instances of Azure for, governments or highly regulated industries.
So if our startup was building a healthcare app that needed to comply with all those like high pay A regulations, we could opt for a sovereign region to ensure like the highest level of security and compliance.
Exactly. It's like having your own private cloud within the Azure cloud.
Wow, okay, so lots of options there. Let's shift gears a bit to cost predictability. With traditional infrastructure, it seems like there are always these unexpected expenses popping up. How does the cloud change that?
Well, with the cloud, you're basically shifting from what we call a capital expenditure model to an operational expenditure model. So instead of, buying all this expensive hardware up front, you just pay for what you use on a subscription basis.
So it's like switching from buying a car to subscribing to a ride-sharing service. You only pay for the miles you drive, and you don't have to worry about maintenance or depreciation.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
That makes a lot of sense. And Azure's pricing is like transparent.
Yes, very transparent.
Yeah.
You can easily estimate your costs and budget accordingly.
Okay, so that's huge for businesses, especially for startups with those limited resources.
Absolutely.
They can really focus on building their product, growing their customer base, without constantly worrying about those unexpected IT costs.
Exactly. And then there's agility, which is the ability to move quickly and adapt to change.
Right.
And the cloud really enables businesses to experiment with new ideas and launch products and services much faster than they could before.
So instead of waiting months to procure and configure all those physical servers,
Exactly.
we can just spin up those virtual machines in Azure in minutes.
Exactly. And Azure has a ton of pre-built services and templates, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you want to try something new.
It sounds like the cloud removes a lot of that friction that used to really slow businesses down.
It does.
It empowers them to be more agile, more innovative, and more responsive to the market demands.
Absolutely. But, it's important to remember the cloud's not a magic bullet. There are still some challenges and considerations.
Yeah.
For example, one common misconception is that serverless computing means that there are literally no servers involved.
Oh, right, yeah.
In reality, there are still servers behind the scenes, but you don't have to manage them.
So it's more about abstracting away all that complexity so developers can focus on writing code, not managing servers.
Exactly. And another myth is that the cloud is inherently less secure than traditional on-premises infrastructure. But as we talked about before, cloud providers, they invest a lot of money in security and compliance,
Right.
often exceeding the capabilities of many businesses.
So it's like having a dedicated team of security experts constantly monitoring and protecting your data.
Absolutely.
What about the myth that the cloud is only for big enterprises?
That's just not true. Azure offers a whole range of solutions for businesses of all sizes, with flexible pricing models to fit any budget.
Okay, so we've debunked some myths and we've highlighted the advantages of cloud computing. But, how do businesses actually choose the right approach? We talked about those different cloud service models, IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through those again?
Yeah. Remember that house analogy we were using?
Yeah.
IaaS is like buying the land and building the house yourself. You've got the most control, but also the most responsibility.
Okay.
PaaS is like hiring a contractor to build the house for you. You still get to choose, the finishes, but you don't have to worry about pouring the foundation or doing the framing.
Right.
And then SaaS is like renting a fully furnished apartment. You get everything you need, but you have less control over, the customization.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Yeah.
So, which model is right for our startup?
Well, it really depends on their needs and their technical expertise. If they have a small team and they want to move quickly, SaaS might be a good option. They can get up and running with a pre-built application and focus on their core business logic.
Right.
If they need more control and customization, PaaS could be a better fit. And then if they've got a larger IT team and they really want complete control of their environment, then IaaS might be the way to go.
So it's not one size fits all. There's a lot to consider when you're choosing a cloud service model.
Absolutely.
But one thing's for sure, the cloud is a powerful tool that can help businesses achieve their goals faster, cheaper, and with much more flexibility than ever before.
Absolutely. But remember, you can't just set it and forget it.
Yeah.
There's still work involved in managing your cloud environment effectively.
Right. And that brings us to that shared responsibility model, which outlines who's responsible for what between the cloud provider and the customer. Can you explain why that's so important?
Sure. Think of it like renting an apartment. The landlord is responsible for the overall building's security, but you're responsible for locking your own door and keeping your belongings safe.
Got it.
So, Azure takes care of securing that underlying infrastructure, but it's up to you to secure your own applications, data, and user access.
So Azure handles the building security, but we need to lock our own doors and windows, so to speak.
Exactly. You still need to implement strong passwords, control user permissions, and protect your data with encryption.
Okay, so it's a partnership.
Yeah, it
We
is.
work together with Azure to ensure a secure and compliant environment.
Exactly. And that responsibility can vary a bit depending on which cloud service model you choose.
Okay.
So with Azure, you have more control, more responsibility,
Yeah.
whereas with SaaS, the cloud provider handles more of that, the heavy lifting.
Okay, so before we move on, let's recap real quick for our listeners. Number one, cloud computing offers tons of advantages for businesses. High availability, scalability, global reach, cost predictability, agility, to name just a few.
Mm,
Number two, understanding those different cloud service models, IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, is really crucial for choosing the right approach.
absolutely.
And number three, that shared responsibility model emphasizes that security is a shared effort. It's not just on Azure, it's on us as well.
Exactly.
We need to be proactive in protecting our data and our applications.
Now, for our listeners out there, I'd like to pose this question. Which of these advantages resonates most strongly with you, and why? How do you see these benefits potentially transforming your work or the industry you're in?
Yeah, that's a great question. Take some time to ponder that, because next time we're going to wrap up our Azure deep dive with a look at some of those key concepts and service models that you need to know to really navigate this exciting world.
Welcome back to our Azure adventure. We've covered a lot, from the fundamentals to the real-world benefits. Now let's dive into some of those essential cloud concepts and service models. It's like getting your Azure driver's license. Understanding the rules of the road before you hit the highway. I like that, good analogy. And just like with driving, you have different options for, how much control you want. Remember those cloud abstraction levels, IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS.
Yeah.
Those are like choosing between driving stick shift, automatic, or just hopping in a taxi.
Okay, I'm listening. So IS, the stick shift option, gives you the most control but requires more skill and effort. When would our startup need to use this?
Well, IaaS is all about renting those raw materials, the servers, the storage, the networking. Then you build your own custom setup.
Yeah.
So imagine our startup has a unique security requirement, or maybe they need a really specific operating system configuration. IaaS gives them that fine-grained control.
So they're basically building their own data center in the cloud, brick by digital brick. But wouldn't that require a lot of technical expertise?
Yeah, it definitely does. IaaS is usually a good fit for businesses that have, experienced IT staff who are comfortable managing all that infrastructure. It's think of it as the DIY approach to cloud computing.
Okay, so for those startups with smaller teams or less specialized needs, there's PA, that automatic option. This is where Azure handles more of the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Exactly. With PaaS, Azure takes care of managing the underlying infrastructure, the servers, the operating systems, the middleware, so you can just focus on building and deploying your applications. It's like building a website using a pre-made framework. You don't have to worry about setting up the server and the database from scratch.
Right. That sounds like a huge time saver, especially for developers who want to get their app up and running quickly. What kind of services does Azure offer under PaaS?
Oh, tons. There's Azure App Service for hosting web applications, Azure SQL Database for managing data, Azure Functions for running serverless code, and a whole bunch more.
Yeah.
It's like having a fully equipped workshop for building and running your applications.
So Azure provides the whole toolkit. Now, SaaS, that's the taxi option, the most hands-off approach. This is like you're renting the whole car, driver included.
Exactly. With SaaS, you're consuming a ready-made software application, over the internet. You don't have to worry about infrastructure, platform, or even, application management. The cloud provider handles everything. Think about using email.
Yeah.
You just log in and use it. You don't have to set up your own email server or worry about software updates.
Yeah, that's true. So what are some popular examples of SaaS?
Well, we use them every day. Think about Microsoft 365 for office productivity, Salesforce for, customer relationship management, or Dropbox for file sharing. These are all SaaS applications that are hosted and managed by the cloud provider.
So SaaS is all about convenience and ease of use, but it sounds like you give up some control over customization and integration compared to IaaS or PaaS.
Yeah, that's true. SaaS applications, they're designed to be those one-size-fits-all solutions. So they might not meet the specific needs of every single business, but they're typically very user-friendly and require minimal technical expertise to get started.
So choosing between IaaS, PaaS and SaaS is like finding that right balance. Control, convenience, cost, it all depends on your specific needs.
Exactly. And one of the, I think, best things about Azure is that it offers services across all three models. So you can mix and match to create like a hybrid approach that really works best for you. For example, our startup might use IaaS for their core infrastructure, PaaS for developing their app, and then SaaS for like email and collaboration tools.
That's a great example. It's like having a buffet of cloud options. You pick and choose what works for you. But no matter which model you choose, you're still responsible for keeping your data and your apps secure.
Absolutely. Remember that shared responsibility model. Azure takes care of the underlying infrastructure. You handle everything you build on top of it. Like renting that apartment, the landlord takes care of the building, you lock your own door.
Right. You can't assume the cloud provider is going to handle everything for you. You still need those strong passwords. You control user permissions, encrypt your data. Exactly. Especially when you're dealing with sensitive data like customer info or, financial records. So before we wrap up our Azure deep dive, some key takeaways for our listeners. Number one, cloud computing offers a range of service models, IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. Each has its pros and cons.
Yeah.
Number two, Azure provides services across all three models, so you can choose the right approach for your needs.
Right.
And number three, security. It's a team effort. You have to be proactive to protect your data and applications.
Absolutely. And as you explore Azure and the whole world of cloud computing, remember it's not just about technology, it's about transforming your business, empowering innovation, and creating new possibilities.
Well said. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Azure Cloud. We've just scratched the surface, but the cloud is constantly evolving, so stay curious and keep learning.